for our first introduction to the story The Roaring Trumpet, written by American science fiction and fantasy authors Sprague de Camp and Fletcher Pratt. I will quote from an essay that Sprague de Camp wrote 19 years after Fletcher's death in honor of his collaborator, called Fletcher and I. With the appearance of John W. Campbell's fantasy magazine, Unknown, Pratt conceived the idea of a series of novellas, in collaboration with me, about a hero who projects himself into the parallel worlds described in our world in myths and legends. We made our protagonist a brash, self-conceited young psychologist named Harold Shea. First, we sent Harold to the world of Scandinavian myth in the Roaring Trumpet. Pratt furnished most of the background for the story, since at that time my knowledge of Norse myth was limited to popular digests and retellings. I had not yet read such splendid sources as the Heimskringla and the Prose Edda. I will only say that they were certainly heroic fantasy or swordplay and sorcery fiction long before these terms were invented. A fan magazine once asserted that in the Harold Shea stories, de Camp furnished the imaginative element and Pratt the controlling logic. Actually, it was the other way around. Pratt had a livelier and more creative imagination than I, but I had a keener sense of critical logic. And now let's begin the story, The Roaring Trumpet by Sprague de Camp and Fletcher Pratt, Chapter 1.
There were 3 men and a woman in the room. The men were commonplace as to face, and 2 of them were commonplace as to clothes. The third wore riding breeches, semi-field boots, and a suede jacket with a tartan lining. The extra fuzzy polo coat and the sporty tan felt with the green feather, which lay on a chair, belonged to him also. The owner of this theatrical outfit was neither a movie actor nor a rich young idler. He was a psychologist, and his name was Harold Shea. Dark, a trifle taller, a little thinner than the average, he would have been handsome if his nose were shorter and his eyes farther apart. The woman was a tawny blonde. She was the chief nurse at the Garrison Hospital. She possessed, but did not rejoice in, the name of Gertrude Mugler. The other 2 men were psychologists like Shea, and members of the same group. The oldest, the director of the others' activities, was bushy-haired and named Reed Chalmers. He had just been asking Shea what the devil he meant by coming to work in such conspicuous garb.
I'm going to ride a horse when I leave this afternoon, honest.
Ever ridden a horse?
The remaining member of the group was a large, sleepy-looking young man named Walter Bayard.
No, but it's about time I learned.
What you ought to say is that you're going to ride a horse so as to have an excuse for looking like something out of Esquire. First, there was that phony English accent you put on for a while. Then you took up fencing. Then, last winter, you smeared the place with patent Norwegian ski grease and went skiing just twice.
So what?
Gertrude Mugler spoke up.
Don't let them kid you about your clothes, Harold.
Thanks, Gert.
Personally, I think you look sweet in them.
Shea's expression was less grateful.
But you're foolish to go horseback riding. It's a useless accomplishment anyway, with automobiles.
Shea held up a hand.
I've got my own reasons, Gert.
Gertrude looked at her wristwatch. She rose.
I have to go on duty. Don't do anything foolish, Harold. Remember, you're taking me to dinner tonight.
Uh-huh.
Dutch. Shea winced.
Gert.
So long, everybody.
She departed in a rustle of starched cotton.
Big He-Man. Dutch.
Shea tried to laugh it off.
I've tried to train her not to pull those in public. Anyway, she makes more money than I do. And if she'd rather have 4 dates a week Dutch than 2 on my budget, why not? She's a good kid.
She thinks you're the wistful type, Harold. She told the super.
She did? God damn it.
Dr. Chalmers interrupted.
I cannot see, Harold, why you continue to keep company with a young woman who irritates you so.
Shea shrugged.
I suppose it's because she's the one not impossible on the staff with whom I'm sure I'll never do anything irrevocable.
While waiting for the dream girl?
Bayard grinned. Shea simply shrugged again.
That's not it. The real reason, Doctor, is that she got the psychological jump on him the first time he took her out. Now he's afraid to quit.
It's not a matter of being afraid.
He stood up.
And furthermore, Walter, I don't see that it's any damn business of yours.
Now, Harold. There's nothing to be gained by these outbursts. Aren't you satisfied with your work here?
Why shouldn't I be? We do about as we damn please, thanks to old man Garriden's putting that requirement for a psychological institute in his bequest to the hospital. I could use more money, but so could everybody.
That's not the point. These poses of yours and these outbreaks of temper point to an inner conflict, a maladjustment with your environment.
Shea grinned.
Call it a little suppressed romanticism. I figured it out myself long ago. Look, Walt here spends his time trying to become Midwestern tennis champ. What good it'll do him. And Gert spends hours at the beauty parlor trying to look like a fallen Russian countess, which she's not built for. Another fixation on the distant romantic. I like to dress up. So what?
That's all right, if you don't start taking your imagining seriously.
Like thinking dream girls exist.
Shea gave him a quick glare.
Oh, well, if you start suffering from depressions, let me know. Let's get down to business now.
More tests on hopheads?
No. We will discuss the latest hypotheses and what we hope will be our new science of paraphysics and see whether we have not reached the stage where more experimental corroboration is possible. I've told you how I checked my premise that the world we live in is composed of impressions received through the senses, but there is an infinity of possible worlds. And if the senses can be attuned to receive a different set of impressions, we should infallibly find ourselves living in a different world. That's where I got my second check here at the hospital in the examination of demets, mainly paranoiacs. You,
He nodded at Bayard.
set me on the right track with that report on the patient with Korsakov's psychosis. The next step would be to translate this theoretical data into experiment. That is, to determine how to transfer persons and objects from one world into another. Among the dements, the shift is partial and involuntary, with disastrous results to the psyche.
Just a minute. Do you mean that a complete shift would actually transfer a man's body into one of these other worlds?
Very likely, since the body records whatever sensations the mind permits. For complete demonstration, it would be necessary to try it, and I don't know that the risk would be worth it. The other world might have such different laws that it would be impossible to return.
You mean if the world were that of classical mythology, for instance, the laws would be those of Greek magic instead of modern physics?
Precisely. But
Hey, then this new science of paraphysics is going to include the natural laws of these different worlds. And what we call physics is just a special case of paraphysics.
not so fast, young man. For the present, I think it wise to restrict the meaning of our term paraphysics to the branch of knowledge that concerns the relationship of these multiple universes to each other, assuming that they actually exist. You will recall that careless use of the analogous term metaphysics has resulted in its becoming practically synonymous with philosophy.
Which is regarded by some as a kind of scientific knowledge, by others as a land of knowledge outside of science, and by still others as unscientific and therefore not knowledge of any kind.
My, very neatly put.
Chalmers fished out a little black notebook.
E.T. Bell could not have said it more trenchantly. I shall include that statement of the status of philosophy in my next book.
Hey,
Shea sat up sharply.
don't I even get a commission?
Chalmers smiled blandly.
My dear Harold, you're at perfect liberty to write a book of your own. In fact, I encourage you.
Bayard grinned.
Harold would rather play cowboy. When I think of a verbal pearl, I don't go around casting it promiscuously. I wait till I can use it in print and get paid for it. But to get back to our subject, how would you go about working the shift?
Chalmers frowned.
I'll get to that if you give me time. As I see it, the method consists of filling your mind with the fundamental assumptions of the world in question. Now, what are the fundamental assumptions of our world? Obviously, those of scientific logic.
Such as,
Oh, the principle of dependence, for instance. Any circumstance in which alone a case of the presence of a given phenomenon differs from the case of its absence is causally relevant to that phenomenon.
ouch, that's almost as bad as Frege's definition of number.
The number of things in a given class
Stop it, Walter. God, it drives me nuts.
is the class of all classes that are similar to the given class.
If you gentlemen are through with your joke, I'll go on. If one of these infinite other worlds, which up to now may be said to exist in a logical, but not in an empirical sense, is governed by magic, you might expect to find a principle like that of dependence invalid, but principles of magic, such as the law of similarity, valid.
What's the law of similarity?
The law of similarity may be stated thus: effects resemble causes. It's not valid for us, but primitive peoples firmly believe it. For instance, they think you can make it rain by pouring water on the ground with appropriate mumbo jumbo.
I didn't know you could have fixed principles of magic.
Certainly. Medicine men don't merely go through hocus pocus. They believe they are working through natural laws. In a world where everyone firmly believed in these laws, that is, in one where all minds were attuned to receive the proper impressions, the laws of magic would conceivably work, as one hears of witch doctor spells working in Africa today. Fraser and Seabrook have worked out some of these magical laws. Another is the law of contagion. Things once in contact continue to interact from a distance after separation. As you
Just a second, Doctor. In a world such as you're conceiving, Would the laws of magic work because people believed in them, or would people believe in them because they worked?
Chalmers put on the smile that always accompanied his intellectual rabbit punches.
That question, Harold, is, in Russell's immortal phrase, a meaningless noise.
No, you don't. That's the favorite dodge of modern epistemologists. Every time you ask them a question they can't answer, they smile and say, "You're making a meaningless noise." I still think it's a sensible question, and as such deserves a sensible answer.
Oh, but it is meaningless. As I can very easily demonstrate, it arises from your attempt to build your conceptualistic structure on an absolutist rather than a relativistic basis. But I'll come back to that later. Allow me to continue my exposition. As you know, you can build up a self-consistent logic on almost any set of assumptions.
Bayard opened his half-closed eyes and injected another sharp observation.
Isn't there a flaw in the structure there, Doctor? Seems to me your hypothesis makes transference to the future possible. We should then become aware of natural laws not yet discovered and inventions not yet made. But the future naturally won't be ignorant of our method of transference. Therefore, we could return to the present with a whole list of new inventions. These inventions launched into the present would anticipate the future, and by anticipating, change it.
Very ingenious, Walter, but I'm afraid you overlook something. You might indeed secure a transference to a future, but it would not necessarily be the future, the actual future of our own empirico-positivist world. A mental frame of reference is required. That is, we need a complete set of concepts of the physical world, which concepts condition the impressions received by the mind. The concepts of the future will be the product of numerous factors not now known to us. That is,
I see. The frame of reference for the actual future is not yet formed, whereas the frames of reference for all past worlds are fixed.
Precisely. I would go beyond that. Transference to any world exhibiting such a fixed pattern is possible, but to such worlds only. That is, one could secure admission to any of H. G. Wells' numerous futures. We merely choose a series of basic assumptions. In the case of the actual future, we are ignorant of the assumptions. But speculative extrapolation from our scanty supply of facts has already carried us halfway to cloud cuckoo land. So let us return to our own time and place and devote ourselves to the development of an experimental technique wherewith to attack the problems of paraphysics. To contrive a vehicle for transposition from one world to another, we face the arduous task of extracting from the picture of such a world as that of the Iliad its basic assumptions and expressing these in
In
logical.
other words, building us a syllogismobile.
Chalmers looked vexed for an instant, then laughed.
a very pithy way of expressing it, Harold. You are wasting your talents, as I have repeatedly pointed out, by not publishing more. I suggest, however, that the term syllogismobile be confined for the present to discussions among us members of the Garrison Institute. When the time comes to try to impress our psychological colleagues with the importance of paraphysics, a somewhat more dignified mode of expression will be desirable.
Harold Shea lay on his bed, smoked and thought. He smoked expensive English cigarettes, not because he liked them especially, but because it was part of his pattern of affectation to smoke something unusual. He thought about Chalmers' lecture. It would no doubt be dangerous, as Chalmers had warned, but Shea was getting unutterably bored with life. Chalmers was able but stuffy. If brilliance and dullness could be combined in one personality, Reed Chalmers combined them. While in theory, all three members of the Institute were researchers, in practice, the two subordinates merely collected facts and left to the erudite doctor the fun of assembling them and generalizing from them.
Of course,
Thought Shea.
I did get some fun out of my little poses, but they were a poor substitute for real excitements. I like wearing my new breeches and boots, but riding a horse had been an excruciating experience. It also had none of the imaginary thrill of swinging along in a cavalry charge, which I had half unconsciously promised myself. All I got was the fact that my acquaintances thought me a nut. Let 'em. I didn't care. But I am too good a psychologist to deceive myself long or completely. I did care. I wanted to make a big impression, but I was one of those unfortunates who adopt a method that produces the effect opposite to the one they want. Hell, no use introspecting myself into the dumps. Chalmers says it'll work. The old bore misfires once in a while, like the time he tried to psychoanalyze the cleaning woman, and she thought he was proposing marriage. But that was an error of technique, not of general theory. Chalmers was sound enough on theory, and he had already warned of dangers in the practical application in this case. Yes, if he said that one could transport oneself to a different place and time by formula, it could be done. The complete escape from insignificance. I confess to myself, I would be the Columbus of a new kind of journey.
Harold Shea got up and began to pace the floor, excited by the trend of his own thoughts. To explore, say, the world of the Iliad. Danger, one might not be able to get back.
Especially not if one turned out to be one of those serf soldiers who died by thousands under the gleaming walls of Troy. Not the Iliad, the Slavic twilight? No, too full of man-eating witches and werewolves. Ireland, that was it. The Ireland of Cuchulainn and Queen Maeve. Blood there, too. But what the hell? You can't have adventure without some danger. At least the dangers were reasonable, open-eye stuff you could handle. And the girls of that world, they were something pretty slick by all description.
It is doubtful whether Shea's colleagues noticed any change in his somewhat irregular methods of working. They would hardly have suspected him of dropping Havelock Ellis for the Ulster and Fenian legendary cycles in which he was conditioning his mind for the attempted trip. If any of them, entering his room suddenly, had come on a list with many erasures, which included a flashlight, a gun, and mercurochrome, they would merely have supposed that Shea intended to make a rather queer sort of camping expedition. And Shea was too secretive about his intentions to let anyone see the equipment he selected: a Colt .38 revolver with plenty of ammunition, a stainless steel hunting knife. They ought to be able to appreciate metal like that, he told himself. A flashlight, a box of matches to give him a reputation as a wonder worker, a notebook, a Gaelic dictionary, and finally the Boy Scout Handbook, edition 1926, as the easiest source of ready reference for one who expected to live in the open air in a primitive society. Shea went home after a weary day of asking questions of neurotics and had a good dinner. He put on the almost new riding clothes and strapped over his polo coat a shoulder pack to hold his kit. He put on the hat with the green feather and sat down at his desk. There, on sheets of paper spread before him, were the logical equations, with their little horseshoes upside-down T's, and identity signs.
My scalp prickled a trifle as I gazed at them. But what the hell? Stand by for adventure and romance.
He bent over, giving his whole attention to the formulas, trying not to focus on one spot, but to apprehend the whole.
If P equals not Q, Q implies not P, which is equivalent to saying either P or Q or neither, but not both. But if not P is not implied by not Q, the counter-implicative form of the proposition.
There was nothing but 6 sheets of paper, just that lying in 2 neat rows of 3 sheets, with perhaps half an inch between them. There should be stripes of table showing between them, but there was nothing. Nothing.
The full argument thus consists in an epicurematic syllogism in Barbara, the major premise of which is not the conclusion of an enthymeme, though the minor premise of which may or may not be the conclusion of a non-Aristotelian so-rights.
The papers were still there, but overlaying the pictures of those 6 white rectangles was a whirl of faint spots of color. All the colors of the spectrum were represented. He noted with the back of his mind that there was a strong tendency toward violet. Round and round they went, round and round.
If either P or Q is true, or Q or R is true, then either Q is true or P or R is false.
Round and round. I could hear nothing at all. I had no sense of heat or cold, or of the pressure of the chair seat against me. There was nothing but millions of whirling spots of color. Yes, I could feel temperature now. I was cold. There was sound too, a distant whistling sound, like that of a wind in a chimney. The spots were fading into general grayness. There was a sense of pressure also on the soles of my feet.
He straightened his legs, yes, standing on something, but everything around him was gray and bitter cold, with a wind whipping the skirts of his coat around him.
I looked down. My feet were there all right. Hello, feet. Pleased to meet you.
But they were fixed in grayish-yellow mud, which had squelched up in little ridges around them. The mud belonged to a track, only 2 feet wide. On both sides of it the gray-green of dying grass began. On the grass, large flakes of snow were scattered, dandruff-wise. More were coming, visible as dots of darker gray against the background of whirling mist, swooping down long parallel inclines, growing and striking the path with the tiniest tss. Now and then one spattered against Shea's face. He had done it. The formula worked.
Welcome to Ireland.
He thanked heaven that his syllogismobile had brought his clothes and equipment along with his person. It would have never done to have been dumped naked into this freezing landscape. The snow was not alone responsible for the grayness. There was also a cold, clinging mist that cut off vision at 100 yards or so. Ahead of him, the track edged leftward round a little mammary of a hill, on whose flank a tree rocked under the melancholy wind. The tree's arms all reached one direction, as though the wind were habitual. Its branches bore a few leaves, as gray and discouraged as the landscape itself. The tree was the only object visible in that wilderness of mud, grass, and fog. Shea stepped toward it. The serrated leaves bore the indentations of the northern scrub oak. But that only grows in the Arctic Circle, he thought. He was bending closer for another look when he heard the clop squash of horses' hooves on the muddy track behind him. He turned. The horse was very small, hardly more than a pony, and shaggy, with a luxuriant tail blowing round its withers. On its back sat a man who might have been tall had he been upright, for his feet nearly touched the ground. But he was hunched before the icy wind driving in behind. From saddle to eyes, he was enveloped in a faded blue cloak. A formless slouch hat was pulled tight over his face, yet not so tight as to conceal the fact that he was full-bearded and gray. Shea took a half a dozen quick steps to the roadside. He addressed the man with the phrase he had composed in advance for his first human contact in the world of Irish myth.
The top of the morning to you, my good man. And would it be far to the nearest hostel?
He had meant to say more, but paused uncertainly as the man on the horse lifted his head to reveal a proud, unsmiling face in which the left eye socket was unpleasantly vacant. Shea smiled weakly, then, gathering his courage, plunged on.
It's a rare bitter December you do be having in Ireland.
The stranger looked at him with much the same clinical detachment he himself would have given to an interesting case of schizophrenia, and spoke in slow, deep tones.
I have no knowledge of hostels, nor of Ireland, but the month is not December. We are in May, and this is the Fimbulwinter.
A little prickle of horror filled Harold Shea, though the last word was meaningless to him. Faint and far his ear caught a sound that might be the howling of a dog or a wolf. As he sought for words, there was a flutter of movement. Two big black birds, like oversized crows, slid down the wind past him and came to rest on the dry grass, looked at him for a second or two with bright, intelligent eyes, then took the air again.
Well, where am I?
At the wings of the world, by Midgard's border.
Where in hell is that?
The deep voice took on an edge of annoyance.
For all things there is a time, a place, and a person. There is none of the three for ill-judged questions and empty jokes.
He showed Shea a blue-clad shoulder, clucked to his pony, and began to move wearily ahead.
Hey,
I was feeling good and sore. The wind made my fingers and jaw muscles ache. I was lost in this Arctic wasteland, and this old goat was about to trot off and leave me stranded.
He leaned forward, planting himself squarely in front of the pony.
what land of a runaround is this, anyway? When I ask someone a civil question,
The pony had halted, its muzzle almost touching Shea's coat. The man on the animal's back straightened, and suddenly, so that Shea could see he was very tall indeed, a perfect giant. But before he had time to note anything more, he felt himself caught and held with an almost physical force by that single eye. A stab of intense, burning cold seemed to run through him, inside his head, as though his brain had been pierced by an icicle. He felt, rather than heard, a voice which demanded,
Are you trying to stop me, niggling?
for his life, Shea could not have moved anything but his lips.
No. This is, I just wondered if you could tell me how I could get somewhere where it's warm.
The single eye held him unblinkingly for a few seconds. Shea felt that it was examining his inmost thoughts. Then the man slumped a trifle, so that the brim of his hat shut out the glare, and the deep voice was muffled.
I will be tonight at the house of the Ponder Severe, which is the crossroads of the world. You may follow.
The wind whipped a fold of his blue cloak, and as it did so, there came, apparently from within the cloak itself, a little swirl of leaves. One clung for a moment to the front of Shea's coat. He caught it with numbed fingers and saw that it was an ash leaf, fresh and tender with the bright green of spring. In the midst of this howling wilderness where only Arctic scrub oak grew. Shea let the pony pass and fell in behind, head down, collar up, hands deep in pockets, squinting against the snowflakes. He was too frozen to think clearly, but he tried.
The logical formulas had certainly thrown me into another world, but I hardly needed the word of old Whiskers that it was not Ireland. Something must have gone haywire in my calculations. Could I go back and recheck them? No, I had not the slightest idea present what might have been on those 6 sheets of paper. I would have to make the best of my situation. But what world had I tumbled into? A cold, bleak one, inhabited by small, shaggy ponies and grim, old, blue-clad men with remarkable eyes. It might be the world of Scandinavian mythology. I knew very little about such a world except that its #1 guy was someone named Odin, or Woden, or Wotan. And there was another god named Thor who threw a sledgehammer at people he disliked. My scientific training made me doubt whether I would actually find these gods operating as gods with more than human powers, or for that matter, whether I would see any fabulous monsters. Still, that stab of cold through my head and that handful of ash leaves needed explaining. Of course, the pain in my head might be an indication of incipient pneumonia, and old Whiskers might make a habit of carrying ash leaves in his pockets.
But still, the big black birds were keeping up with them. They didn't seem afraid, nor did they seem to mind the ghastly weather. It was getting darker, though in this landscape of damp blotting paper, Shea could not tell whether the sun had set. The wind pushed at him violently, forcing him to lean into it. The mud on the path was freezing, but not quite gelid. It had collected in yellow gobs on his boots. He could have sworn the boots weighed 30 pounds apiece, and they had taken in water around the seams, adding clammy socks to his discomfort. A clicking sound like a long roll of castanets made him wonder, until he realized it was caused by his own teeth. He seemed to have been walking for days, though he knew it could hardly have been a matter of hours. Reluctantly, he took one hand from his pocket and gazed at his wristwatch. It read 9:56, certainly wrong. When he held the watch to a numbed ear, he discovered it had stopped. Neither shaking nor winding could make it start.
I thought of asking my companion the time, but realized that the writer would have no more accurate idea than myself. I thought of asking how much farther we had to go, but I would have to make myself heard over the wind, and the old boy's manner did not encourage questions.
They plodded on. The snow was coming thickly through the murky twilight. Shea could barely make out the figure before him. The path had become the same neutral gray as everything else. The weather was turning colder. The snowflakes were dry and hard, stinging and bouncing where they struck. Now and then, an extra puff of wind would snatch a cloud of them from the moor, whirling it into Shea's face. He would shut his eyes to the impact, and when he opened them, find he had blundered off the path and have to scurry after his guide.
Light. I pulled the pack around in front of me and fumbled in it till I felt the icy touch of the flashlight's metal. I pulled it out from under the other articles and pressed the switch button. Nothing happened, nor would shaking, slapping, or repeated snappings of the switch produce any result. In a few minutes, it would be too dark for me to follow the man on the pony by sight alone. Whether the old boy liked it or not, I would have to ask the privilege of holding a corner of his cloak as a guide.
It was just as he reached this determination that something in the gait of the pony conveyed a sense of arrival. A moment more, and the little animal was trotting, with Shea stumbling and skidding along the fresh snow behind as he strove to keep pace. The pack weighed tons, and he found himself gasping for breath as though he were running up a 45-degree angle instead of on an almost level path. Then there was a darker patch in the dark gray universe. Shea's companion halted the pony and slid off. A rough-hewn timber door loomed through the storm, and the old man banged against it with his fist. It opened, flinging a flood of yellow light out across the snow. The old man stepped into the gap, his cloak vividly blue in the fresh illumination. Shea, left behind, croaked a feeble,
"Hey!"
just managing to get his foot in the gap in the closing door. It opened full out, and a man in a baggy homespun tunic peered out at him, his face rimmed with drooping whiskers.
Well?
"May I come in?"
Come on, come on. Don't stand there letting the cold in.
This completes our first episode of The Roaring Trumpet.